Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Alessandria Polizzi. I am the CEO of Burnout Consulting. We focus on workplace mental health, and I'm also one of the coordinators, the originators of HR Wellbeing Week alongside Ben Eden. And this is a project we do. This is our third one. And so this is my session. This is my session to share with you what I've learned over the last 12 months in talking about HR well-being and what that has taught me, and what tips and tools and resources I can share that I would recommend. So we're going to be going through 12 things in 12 months really quickly. So it all started for me about a year ago. I put out this poll on LinkedIn to see what were HR teams thinking about when it comes to the well-being of their own teams. I'm a former chief people officer myself, been in HR for 2 decades. And so, I had a sense of how people were investing in their teams, but I was really surprised to see how few were building a plan that focused on the well-being of their teams. And so that really got me very curious about, well, why is that? Why don't we take care of our own? And so I started to learn more about that. Fast forward to just a few months ago, Forbes published this research survey that interviewed about 600 HR professionals around the US and the UK, and 98% of the people who participated in that survey showed symptoms of being burned out. So that's a huge percentage when we think about the overall population. And clearly, this is a big problem for us in the HR function. So again, a little bit about me as a background: former chief people officer, worked in a wide variety of industries, started this company in 2021, focusing on workplace well-being and workplace mental health. Last year, we won several awards for the programs that we offer. We are top workplace wellness provider, top workplace stress provider, reduction provider. We aren't hired to stress people out. And we also certify organizations as being psychologically safe against the global guidelines that have been established. I also am fortunate to have about 60 to 70 affiliates who are certified around the globe who can also support organizations, and they come from a wide variety of backgrounds, as you can see here. So one thing I've noticed is I speak about HR well-being, and I've been speaking probably once or twice, probably about 3 to 4 times actually a month on HR well-being. And these are the kinds of comments that I get, and I get a lot of comments that we're surprised to learn that HR well-being is a thing. We're surprised about the loneliness that happens in HR. And I titled this talk, I thought it was just me, because that is the #1 comment that I get when people attend my sessions is, I really thought that this was just me. There was something wrong with me. When you'll see, it isn't just to the single person or an individual gap or weakness. Rather, this is part of the job. And so what I want to do is go through the what, the why, and the how we can take action around HR well-being and taking care of ourselves and our teams. So let's get into it. Actually, before we do, I'm curious, for those of you who joined or signed up for this event, how many of you are concerned about the overall well-being of your HR teams? If this is a concern for you, go ahead and put an X in the chat for me. Thanks, Kevin. About 40%. Okay, 50. Again, just trying to gauge, is this something that's top of mind for everyone, or is this just I'm more curious to learn more? because we're going to be going through just the journey I've been on and giving you insights as we go. So the first one, thank you for those of you who responded. So the first thing that really got me interested in this was this article. And this article is an academic study that looked at HR burnout. And they called out things like senior management's inability to see the importance of HR, lack of appreciation for the profession, lack of opportunities for advancement. So in the chat, what year do you think this was written? Just getting a sense of that context around burnout in HR, not being valued, not seeing the importance, not seeing the appreciation. Let's see what guesses we can get on what year that was written. We got a 2020 here. Got a couple 2020s. Oh, 2022. 2015. Thank you. Okay. It's probably going to shock you. It did me. This was written in 1992. So for over 30 years, we have been aware of that burnout is a huge risk in HR. We have studies and research that's been done on it, and yet it's not something that we're often talking about. And you can see the kinds of comments I get in general from other HR professionals when we talk about HR burnout. What I found is it became, as I was doing more research in this area and I built more and more programs in this area and supported more and more HR teams, it's a broken record. We go round and round and round with many of the same things. And I'm going to share what those are with you in a minute. But there are a ton of research studies on specific risks and hazards to our mental health as a result of being in the HR function. And this isn't just a US issue. As you can see, since this has been around since 1992, this isn't a new generation issue. This is something that has been scientifically proven to have a weight and create a risk of exhaustion and other issues for us within HR. So to understand this globally, I did a series on my podcast called the Psychological Safety World Tour, where I interview people from around the globe to get a sense of how is workplace well-being, workplace mental health, workplace psychological safety, those concepts that seem relatively new, but maybe aren't as we start to see the research. How are those being understood and implemented in different parts of the world? And to a person, there wasn't one person that I interviewed that said, well, we're crushing it in this part of the world. Almost every single person on that podcast, it doesn't matter where we were, said, oh, I feel like other parts of the world are further ahead than we are. Even places like Australia, where they've had guidelines since 2007, they have national requirements of psychological safety. Mexico has had the same in place since 2018, as has Canada. And so that's since 2007. So I learned a lot in talking to people from around the globe that this is not a specific US issue. These are issues that are pretty pervasive and universal. But this one really got me, and I'm going to share some of these data points with you now about what's going on, why is this happening, and then of course we'll talk about what to do about it. So come with me on the journey. But I want to share with you this study from SAGE. So this report came out a few months ago. I do a monthly update on workplace mental health insights and research on TikTok. And so sometimes on LinkedIn. So this was part of that study. So in this research study, they said that a certain percentage of HR feels like HR is too much work. You may have also seen this, SHRM put this on their website as well. So in the chat, what percent of HR believes that the work is too much? %. Let's see, 60%. 85. Some good guesses here. 98. Joanna, I'll come back to you. Yep, because the answer, and this was actually on SHRM's website as well, 95%. 95% of the HR professionals that SAGE spoke that they had involved in their research that they used for this document, this research study, 95% felt that HR is too much work. So that's a pretty high percentage of people feeling like the work is too much to handle, right? And of course, that's simple math, right? If 98% of people in HR are feeling burned out and 95% feel like it's too much work, those things match, right? They go together. But here's some things that don't go together and where we have kind of a conflict happening, if you will. So they said that 57% of the C-suite see HR and people leaders as equal leadership partners in the organization. I want to pause on that because I go, okay, 57. That means that I'm not good at math, but that's 43% who don't feel that way, right? So if you're in one of those 43% organizations, then of course there's going to be a conflict when you want to make you want to influence decisions within the business that only makes sense. And 84% of HR leaders feel that C-suite were previously unclear on the value that HR brings. Okay, so we're going to come back to this in a little bit. The other thing that came from the study was, despite HR teams picking up more strategic work, almost 60% of the C-suite see HR as a largely administrative function. If you agree that we're mostly an administrative function, put a Y in the chat. If you think that we're more of a strategic function, put an N in the chat for me. Let's see where our group lands. Got a lot of N's. Is there administrative work to do? Of course there is. Every job has administrative work to do. But are we a largely administrative function? Well, 43% think that that's true. And then this was my favorite, was that 76% of the C-suite thinking that HR's workload is completely manageable. When we have 98% burnout, 95% feeling like they can't, that's too much work, and then 2/3, what is that? No, 3/4 of the C-suite see it very differently. No wonder we're at conflict between what the business expectations are, which is probably 50-50 administrative, and 7 3/4 saying and totally doable. There's a mismatch there. So I'm curious from the group, what do you think happens when we have these very different belief systems? What do you think happens to the people in the HR function? Share your thoughts in the chat for me. And I can call it, so we don't get heard yet, more turnover. There's going to be a research study coming out tomorrow, a survey coming out tomorrow. I can't really share much about it, but I was interviewed about the data that talks about that, Caroline. But let me add this. For the last 18 months, LinkedIn has listed the HR function as the function with the highest turnover. So it's not just turnover ideation, it's turnover action. Yeah, being undervalued and burned out. That conflict is big. Okay, so that's what's happening, right? That's what's happening agnostically, based on the data, based on research that's been done, lots of research, global perspective. Okay, well, why? What are some of the things that impact us from an HR perspective? And again, I'm just sharing some of the things I've learned over the last 12 months. The first one is really understanding the value of the work, like we just talked about. If a large percentage of the C-suite sees our function as administrative and completely manageable, then the value of investing in something that, from their perspective, is kind of working, there's just not a lot of funds being invested there. And that feeling of not being valued, it can have a huge impact on us because it starts to feel like we're just checking the box. Now, I've hosted a lot of events over the last 12 months. I just realized I didn't share properly, so let me do that so that you can actually hear people speak. And I'm going to share a few snippets from those various conversations with you. And we'll start with this one from Armando.
But the initial perspective was, this is a check the box because we want to make sure that our strategy reflects that we have this in our playbook. And I just stopped and I said, okay, it's one thing to have it in your playbook. The other piece is, how's it going to be part of your culture, and what are you going to do as far as really launching this in an effective manner? I can give you a sample policy, then all you need to do is insert the company name that says XYZ company is now committed to diversity in the workplace, and we're going to do blah, 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 blah. Check the box and you're done. Or is this an opportunity for you to say, here's what my vision is at the end of this journey from a cultural change perspective, and how are we going to get there? And I think it sort of stopped the leadership team in their initial enthusiasm to get this done, to sort of back off and realize that it wasn't just going to be check the box, we snap our fingers, we distribute the policy, and we're good.
Has anybody on the call ever had that experience of, here's what it takes to do the work, we said the outcomes we want, and then here is what we need to do in order to just check the box? How many of us have had to weigh between the two? If you've had to do that, go ahead and put another exclamation point for me in the chat. You know, if we end up having the appetite to just do the check the box, I'm just curious how many of us. So Caroline, for sure. Okay, great. Anyone feel like coming off mute and sharing their story? While I wait for some people to maybe feel like they want to share their story. One research study I was looking at the other day, because I do a lot of work with DEI teams around psychological health and safety, is that the average tenure for a chief diversity officer, this is what they were calling the role, is 1.8 years. And the vast majority of people who leave those roles do not seek other roles within the diversity function, or with that as their mandate. That's a huge insight into these types of conversations and what that can mean for us as HR professionals. I'm guessing no one feels like sharing, which is fine. That's fine. I can share. So one, the understanding the value of HR. When I burned out as a chief people officer, my mindset was, if I was only better at articulating the business case, other people would believe me that we should make these investments. I have since come to accept that nothing I said would have changed their minds. I did the best I could, and that's all I could do. And so, but that owning and feeling like somehow this is something you're asking for you, that's hard to let go of, because it can feel personal, because we care so much about the people. The other area I've seen studied, researched, and talked about when it comes to HR burnout is something called toxin handling. I mentioned this in one of our earlier panels, but I want to talk a little bit about what toxin handling is. So basically, what they found is that 80 to 85% of HR professionals have the symptoms of what of toxin handling, which is absorbing the emotional toxins, the vitriol, the venting from other people. And so this might look like, being a really empathetic listener, providing safe spaces for people, having confidential conversations. We're going to talk about those confidential conversations in a little bit. Having to reframe difficult messages like a layoff or other decisions that are a little tricky. Suggesting solutions and problem solving, especially when it comes to interpersonal conflict, and then providing coaching, advising, and counsel. If you are ever fill in this role, I'm curious, how many of these, there's 6, how many of these 6 things do the folks on the call today feel like they partake in on a relatively frequent basis? So your score can be between 0 to 6, all 6. Welcome, toxin handlers, welcome. Anybody here a 0? I would doubt it, because some of this is in our job description. And some of this we just do because we're just good humans, right? Yeah. So when we do this type of what's called toxin handling, what's important is that we detox ourselves, right? Just like you would if you were exposed to any other toxin, you want to make sure that you're able to shed that, you're able to recover from that, you're understanding the weight that that can have when it comes to your needs and how you are at home. Because if we don't do that, then it puts us at risk for things like depression, anxiety, burnout, and something called compassion fatigue, which I'll talk about in a second. But again, this is well documented. I had never heard of it until I started doing this research, but well documented. All right. The second one I just mentioned, which is compassion fatigue, I call this the Toby syndrome. So hopefully some of you have seen The Office, you've seen Toby. But compassion fatigue is commonly found in the highly caring professions. I first heard of it when I worked in the veterinary space. Often we hear about it in the healthcare industry. We can sometimes hear about it in teaching, other places where you have to show care for others. And so when you have gotten to the point of compassion fatigue, which is I have given and given and given of myself to the point where I have nothing left to give, we kind of flip into this space where we are now experiencing compassion fatigue, which will look like that distancing, that detachment from our emotions. And this will show up not just at work, but also in our personal relationships. You might find that our empathy that we used to have, our care about, has left the building, right? It's definitely reduced. We get potentially into victim blaming or cynicism, lack of joy in the work we used to enjoy. Our performance obviously will decrease because our passion for the work has dissipated immensely. And so I call this the Toby syndrome, because if we think about some of the biased, stereotypical HR characters or caricatures that you see in media, that's this person. That's somebody who is experiencing compassion fatigue. They're the fun police. They're the don't care about, just fill out this paperwork for the policy, sign this document, right? Many of us, we started in HR because we wanted to help people grow, be the best versions of themselves. Nobody on the list put that they joined HR to be in an administrative function, right? We joined it to do more. And so if we don't refill ourselves, then we put ourselves at risk of compassion fatigue. I'm going to talk about some things we can do to avoid these outcomes here in a second, but I wanted to share this with you. And of course, the last one is the one we hear the most about, which is burnout.
I'll go back to 2020, unpacking a pandemic. I was in the healthcare field, unpacking a pandemic, unpacking the murder of George Floyd. I worked really, really hard early in my career to make sure that I separated that girl from the South with that PTSD from what I experienced growing up with the work that I was doing in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. This is a business case. This is my personal experience. Well, guess what? Crash. So now professional Kim is impacted, right? How do I deal with that? And this has been a real journey. I've never had to deal with that before. I've never felt like crying in a meeting at work before. I've never realized how much I took on other people's pain, and between the pain and sitting through incident command, trying to watch healthcare disparities and how we're going to address that, I was exhausted.
And this is something we have to pay attention to, because we often deal with very tricky personal situations, whether we're doing an investigation or working a process, or we're coaching someone on overcoming, a challenge. We're having to give guidance when we're doing a riff. There's a wide variety of ways in which we are exposed to what's called secondary trauma. And what Kim mentioned is when that trauma can be very personal and become more re-traumatization. And so when we do that, we need to make sure we understand the impact that has on our mental health. because if we just try to ignore it, it's going to come out in other ways. So being more aware of those things that are sensitive for us, that are difficult for us, giving ourselves space and grace to grieve. Those are things that we don't often talk about in HR. In fact, we try to shove it down because we try to pretend like it doesn't faze us, just like Kim used to do, right? Just like she said, this is a business case. This is personal. Sometimes those walls come down. All right, so we've talked about why these things come up. I'm curious of the things we've talked about: toxin handling, compassion, fatigue, burnout from the group. Which one of these, if any, do you think you've seen others experience, or you've had some level of experience with yourself, if you feel comfortable sharing? And I have to pull down the shade. Now, I know we've got some toxin handlers because I see some 6s. Thank you, Cindy. Oh, Caroline, all of them. Oh, dear. Yes, all. Okay. All right. I didn't put this in the slides, so I'm just going to tell you, and I'll give you my contact information. For anyone who says all of them, or you feel like the burnout is an issue for you, please reach out to me. I have a free, it's the gold standard MBI. It's the burnout inventory that I am offering to all participants for this event. So please reach out to me. I will send that to you and make that available so that you can see where you are on the scale as it comes to burnout. So happy to provide that. All right, so now we've learned about all the things, right? Okay, this is real. It's not imagined. I'm not alone. Science tells me that these things are known hazards within the HR function. Now what? Now what do I do? Right? That's all interesting, Al. Very depressing. But what do we do? Okay, so I'm going to give you my 4 things I've learned about. I have a ton more. The 4 things I've learned about that can be particularly helpful for us within the HR function. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and your ideas as well. Number 1 is we have to start connecting with each other. We have to feel comfortable talking about the fact that I felt sad, I felt afraid, I had feelings, right? So getting in touch with ourselves and reaching out and being comfortable talking to each other. Because one of the other areas that's a risk for us in HR is loneliness. This is can be one of the most lonely positions in the company. And I spoke about that on my podcast as well.
You can't really talk to anybody else. You can't tell your team if the company's up for sale or anything else is going on, or if there's an issue with the board or an issue with the CEO. You're kind of holding that in your space, right? And then you also have CEOs and boards that are coming to you for advice or asking you to work through and lead a project. So it is a very lonely space. It is, you can't just walk into the lunchroom and have lunch with anybody, right? So where do you have lunch? Who do you have lunch with? It's that raised eyebrow.
So curious from the group, what are some reasons why HR can be lonely, and why should we be reaching out to each other? What are some reasons why it can be lonely? Yeah, we can't do things with people at work, right? Confidentiality, appearing to be biased, right? Having to keep those confidences. Yeah, and no, thank you, Cindy. No one to talk to about how we feel, right? With the stay neutral, less of a team atmosphere. So true, because we see ourselves as serving these other teams. What I see a lot of times is, oh, I'm aligned to the business. So the connection is more with the business partners that they work with, which is great, but they can't relate to the work that we're doing. And so the number one thing that you can do, the number one thing that you can do is connect with yourself. But number 2 is also connect with other HR people. Make this more of an opportunity, not to just vent, but to share ideas, share best practices, go to those networking meetings. It may seem silly, but it will help a lot, because we need to refill, right? We need to wash away those toxins and refill our buckets. All right. The second one that we can work on, and that I've learned a lot about in the last 12 months, is boundaries. We have to figure out how to turn it off. This has come up a lot the last 2 days, and setting those boundaries and knowing when to say no and feeling comfortable in our power to say no, not feeling like we have to be fried to the point of, dysfunction and exhaustion in order to take rest. And this came up yesterday. People were saying, well, if I take time off, I have so much work to do. It's it's not worth it, right? If you're a department of one, that can be exhausting, but you can't be your best if you're completely spent. No job is worth that. As one of the speakers yesterday said, you're replaceable at work. You are not replaceable in your relationships. And so making sure that you've set some boundaries and you know how to power off is really important. And I know it's one of those things that we kind of dismiss. I know I did, because these other folks need me. But you won't be there if you don't take care of yourself. I spoke, again, another guest on my podcast about this topic.
So one, I do a lot of teaching about the art of doing less to get more out of life, both in home and in work. So what does it mean to sit down, do less? It's very interesting. I don't think I realized that at one point I asked a client, we talked about, okay, we're gonna have a day where you're just gonna take care of yourself. I want you to, rest. And then they're like, okay, I'm gonna rest on Saturday or whatever. And then I asked very specifically, okay, well, what are you gonna do? What's on your to-do list? And then they started listing off all of these things. And I'm like, let's do the laundry, do this. And I'm like, what is this? So I have to be very specific about what is rest actually, what does self-care look like? And I need examples, and I have to do this. Nope, that doesn't count. Nope, that doesn't count. Start over. And it's funny, but it's also very telling in terms of like how we are taking care of ourselves. And
so for those on the call, I'd love for you to share what's one thing that you can do this weekend that will be you taking care of yourself. One thing that you enjoy doing. I like to quote Schitt's Creek on this one. If you take a selfish, what would you be doing? Let's get some ideas going. Oh yes, read something fun. I'm reading some sci-fi right now, Cindy, and I am loving it. Oh, go on a holiday, more reading. Yes, don't read a business book. Hockey game, nice. Turn off the phone, hit the beach. Amazing, Linda. So even just, and this is a little extra, even when we envision ourselves doing those things, our brain can experience that as if it's really happening as well. So just when you're feeling overwhelmed, you can't go run out and go play hockey, but you can picture yourself, you can imagine the sound of the ice, you can imagine the sound of the skates, you can imagine being there, the feel of the temperature. Or the opposite, like Amy, go to the hot springs. That sounds amazing. So I want to join Amy for sure. So knowing what these things are that can help, again, what are we doing? We're refilling ourselves so that we can give, we can be our best version of ourselves. We don't want to be the one who's doing the laundry, right? Okay, so that's two. The third one that is really important, I touched on this for those of you who are in the panel this morning, about connecting to your values. And that sounds a little, why do I need to do that? Well, if we don't know why we're working and doing the work that we're doing, then of course we're going to take on everything that comes at us because it must just be to get things done. What is your purpose? What is most important to you? And don't just brush by it. Sit down and really think about what's most important to you. And this can change over time. So I suggest minimum, maybe Happy New Year while you have a hangover. Think about what are my values and for me for this year, and how am I doing? Am I spending time on the things that are most important to me? Am I moving the ball forward in a way that's meaningful to me as a human? Because your needs are really, really important. I mentioned Susan David earlier, and I have a video where she talks about this a little bit more.
There's also been research, of course, very pervasive and very important in organizational conversations at the moment, is the idea of unconscious bias, okay? Having biases around females, around gender and so on, that are really important for organizations to work through effectively. But we also know that individuals take on the unconscious bias of society. So for example, if I'm a female working in an all-male environment, I might unwittingly have absorbed the unconscious bias that I'm in the wrong profession.
Right.
Okay? And we know that that is true. So we know, for example, that females who are in professions that have high levels of bias against females in that industry, when they experience hardship, when they experience career setbacks, when they experience failings, are more likely to give up, to just throw in the towel.
Oh, I don't have the back part of that video, which is the best part, which is when she says, when we know what our values are, then that bolsters us against absorbing those biases, and it decreases the likelihood of self-criticism and departure. So in the chat, I just put an HR bias checklist that I'd love for you to go ahead and download, and I'd love for you to take this HR bias survey and let me know what your average score is. So this is, the question is, rate the questions below using the following scale. How often have I heard these things, right? Have you heard them? Never, sometimes, or always. And go ahead and take a moment. You can download that, or you can just pull it off of the screen. Feel free. But I am curious to see what our scores are. Oh, you're not seeing it in the chat? Let me try sending it one more time. Thanks, Kevin. Is that showing up? We can do this the old-fashioned way too. Okay, thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Christina. .1, not bad. Not bad. Anyone else have a score that they can share? Okay, 2.8. Wow. .9. Okay. So what I want us to think about, though, as we think about these biases, which of these do you believe are true? Not about you, obviously, but in general. Because I think sometimes we do see HR in this light, right? Or we can. And so being aware of how we may have absorbed, as Susan says, absorb those biases can give us insight as well into what kind of talk tracks are we carrying around, and how do we see the function and the work that we do? Because if we don't value it, or if we believe that we don't add value, then of course no one else can. All right, last but not least tidbit, which is we have to nurture and care for ourselves. That if we don't care for ourselves, no one will. And so remember that survey I showed at the very beginning of our talk, which was what well-being plan for HR. If we don't take care of ourselves, we can't care for others. And so there are simple things we can do to help take care of ourselves. Things like practicing self-compassion, speaking to ourselves with kindness, understanding the known hazards for the HR function, and then making sure we take care of ourselves and we decrease the risk of those having an impact. And of course, setting boundaries and connecting with other people. All of these things are things that you can do to help yourself, before we move on, to help yourself flourish and grow. I'm curious from the group, of the things we talked about, be it making connections with others, making sure we set boundaries, thank you, Linda, spending time understanding our values and our goals, focusing on that taking care of ourselves and self-kindness, what can you commit to doing today for you? Put that in the chat for me. Boundaries. Thank you, Michelle. Ask for help. Yes, absolutely. Yep, understanding your values. That's a big one, Kevin, because I think we assume we know why we're doing what we're doing, but yeah, Chris, please, yes, not being so hard on ourselves. Really good, really good. And saying no more frequently. You can say no in a bunch of different ways. And one of them might be saying yes. Yes, I can see why that might be important. And here are some other options that aren't me answering the phone. Detoxing. Thank you, Linda, for all of our toxin handlers. It's really important that we focus on that. Okay, everyone. Well, those are my 12 things I've learned in the last, well, I've learned a lot more. One of the things I've learned is how much I really appreciate my fellow HR friends. And so just seeing some of you here, we've had almost 400 people sign up for this event. I'm here to help be a resource for anyone if they need that support. As I mentioned before, I have resources on my website. We have an entire dedicated page just for HR and HR well-being. So check that out. And you can get there by going to verdantconsulting.net. If you'd like to sign up for my newsletter, there's the QR code right there. Also, that's my email. If you're interested in the burnout assessment, just send me an email, completely free, no obligations. But I think it gives good insight into the three components and symptoms of burnout. So that can be very helpful. As somebody who was in HR and burned out there, it's really important that we pay attention. With that, let me open up if there's any questions or comments. You can also find me, by the way, I am on TikTok as Dr. Al Polizzi. I post regularly as your HR big sister. And then, of course, I run amok on LinkedIn all the time. So connect with me on LinkedIn at the very least. Oh, thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate it. And hopefully everybody took away one thing that they can learn. I learned 12 or more over the last year, but hopefully everyone can take away at least one thing that they can apply right away so you can start feeling better. All right, everyone, thanks so much. Hopefully we will see you tomorrow, our last day for HR Wellbeing Week. With that, everyone, thanks so much and have a great rest of your day. Bye.